The wind screamed down the slopes of Glenridge like something alive, slamming against houses and clawing at rooftops with icy fingers. In the heart of town, beneath the flickering glow of a failing street lamp, Glenridge Police Station stood like a stubborn outpost defying the elements. It was nearing 1 a.m., and the worst winter storm Colorado had seen in decades was just beginning to show its teeth. Inside, Officer Lauren Tate sat hunched over her desk in the dim light, the collar of her uniform jacket pulled tight against the draft that seemed to seep through every crack in the old station. A half-empty mug of black coffee had gone cold beside her elbow, and a stack of reports remained untouched. Her eyes were dry, her head heavy. Graveyard shifts during winter were always slow, and on a night like this, everyone who had any sense was already hunkered down at home. Radar says the wind's peaking at 70, Rookie Officer Ben Keller mumbled from across the room, eyes fixed on the weather monitor like it might suddenly grow teeth. Feels like we're about to get buried alive. Lauren didn't look up. That's why we check on the seniors and make sure the generator's working, not so we can sit here and complain about it. Ben grinned faintly, but the tension in his posture didn't budge. This was his second week on the job, and Glenridge's sleepy quiet hadn't yet fooled him into thinking it was a place without danger. Especially not tonight. Then came the noise. A sharp crash. A door slamming against something, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scrambling across tile. Lauren was on her feet before Ben could speak, her training kicking in. One hand went to her sidearm, the other signaling Ben to stay behind as she moved down the hall toward the lobby. The storm howled louder through the cracked entryway, pushing in snow and chaos. And then she saw it. Standing beneath the overhead light, panting heavily, was a massive German shepherd. His coat was soaked, matted in places with streaks of crimson. Water pooled beneath him, tinted red. His eyes, deep amber and burning with something close to desperation, locked with hers. He didn't growl, didn't flinch. He just stood there, as if willing her to understand. And on his back, bundled in torn flannel and secured with a strip of fabric, was a baby. "Ben!" Lauren barked, lowering her weapon and rushing forward. "Get medical, right now!" Ben skidded to a stop beside her, staring in disbelief. Is she breathing?" Lauren dropped to her knees. The dog didn't move, only tilted slightly to allow her better access. She pulled the fabric aside gently, heart pounding in her ears. A small pale face peeked out, eyes squeezed shut, lips parted. Then, softly, miraculously, the baby whimpered. "She's alive," Lauren whispered, breath catching. "Oh my God, she's alive." The shepherd let out a single bark, short, clipped, as if confirming the fact. Blood continued to drip from a gash along his side. His legs trembled slightly, but he remained standing. Then he turned, staggered toward the shattered door, looked back. He wanted them to follow. The day before, the Green household had been quieter than usual. Their two-story home on the edge of Glenridge backed into a forest of towering pines, and though it offered a peaceful view, peace was in short supply lately. Tyler Green sat at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, grease still under his fingernails. He scrolled through job listings on his phone with the defeated air of a man who'd already seen them all. A final notice from the utility company fluttered on the refrigerator door behind him. His left knee ached from long hours bent under trucks, and the bills weren't getting any smaller. In the living room, Kayla Green bounced their 8-month-old daughter, Harper, gently against her shoulder. Kayla's scrubs lay folded on the couch, a reminder of the pediatric nursing job she'd left after Harper's birth. Childcare costs had made returning to work impossible. Now, with Tyler's job hours slashed and the mortgage looming, the silence between them had turned into something heavier. "I called about the rental in West Ridge," Tyler said, breaking the quiet. "It's $300 cheaper, but they've got a no-pets policy." Kayla looked down at Harper, then out the window. On the porch, Max, their German shepherd, lay curled on the welcome mat, alert. He didn't wag his tail. He was listening. "You're not seriously thinking," she began. "We can't afford dog food, Kayla." "Hell, we're rationing formula. The place in West Ridge is warm, dry. It has running water. We'll have to call the shelter." Kayla didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on Max, who now stood and paced the porch, ears perked. He always seemed to know when something was wrong. That night, as the wind picked up and snow began to fall in thick, wet clumps, Max didn't take his usual place at the foot of the bed. Instead, he stood in the hallway outside Harper's room, tail still, muscles tense. The barometer dropped. Windows began to rattle. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked. At 2:47 a.m., the storm reached its peak. The old pine in the backyard, 40 feet tall and wide as a sedan, snapped at the trunk. The sound was thunderous, an explosion of wood and wind. It came crashing through the roof above Harper's room, sending beams and shingles and snow cascading down like a tidal wave of destruction. Max moved first. The floor tilted. Joists groaned. The crib had been shoved into the corner by the falling debris. The ceiling above it bowed ominously, held back only by a splintered beam. Harper was screaming. Max leapt. Ignoring the cuts from glass and wood, shouldered his way into the wreckage and nudged the baby's blanket loose with his teeth. He worked quickly, methodically, pulling, wrapping, adjusting. Then, using the fabric of Kayla's quilt, he bound Harper to his back, knotting the ends with his mouth. Below, Tyler lay half-crushed beneath the stairwell, and Kayla was pinned under a section of roof. "Max," Tyler whispered hoarsely, spotting the dog above through the dust and debris. "Get her out. Go." Max didn't hesitate. He turned from the wreckage, limped through the buckled hallway, and pushed his body through a cracked front door into the blizzard. 3 miles. Through gale-force winds, collapsed power lines, and ice-strewn roads. Max didn't stop. When the straps loosened, he stopped to tighten them with trembling jaws. When a branch cut his shoulder, he kept going. When the cold made his muscles seize, he pressed on. Until finally, bleeding, frostbitten but unbroken, he reached the only place he knew could help, the police station. And there, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, in the middle of a floor slick with blood and melting snow, he stood until someone listened, until someone understood. The snow had softened into a bitter silence by the time Officer Lauren Tate threw on her parka and stepped out of the station. The wind still whipped around corners like a thing alive, but the sharp rage of the storm had dulled into a heavy, relentless cold. The German shepherd stood at the threshold, bleeding and trembling, his amber eyes scanning the dark street before him. Then, without a sound, he took off down the ice-glazed sidewalk, limping slightly but determined. Lauren followed, radio clipped to her shoulder, boots crunching through snow. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1. I've got a civilian canine leading me on foot. Unknown destination. Keep EMS on standby." She didn't know where they were going, but she trusted that the dog did. Something about him, his focus, his composure, wasn't like any animal she'd worked with in her 15 years on the force. Injured, exhausted, and possibly hypothermic, he moved with the purpose of a soldier on a mission. Ben Keller had offered to come along, but Lauren waved him off. The roads were still impassable in most places, and someone needed to stay with the baby. Little Harper was bundled in the warming station, monitored by the town's on-call EMT, who had just arrived. Lauren didn't need backup. What she needed was answers, and the dog seemed determined to provide them. They turned off Main Street and crossed into the outskirts of Glenridge, where pine trees leaned in over power lines like ancient watchmen. Fallen limbs blocked part of the road, and twice she had to scale over debris, using gloved hands to steady herself. The shepherd never once turned to check if she was behind. He simply moved forward, head low, ears pinned back, tail still. Lauren knew that kind of determination. It was the kind a canine showed when lives were on the line. The houses grew farther apart as they moved toward the edge of town. Then the dog veered sharply to the right, slipping through a break in a wooden fence. Beyond it, a large pine tree lay split in two, its trunk cleaving through the roof of a modest two-story home. Smoke curled from a busted gas line near the collapsed porch, and in the snow just ahead of the wreckage, Lauren spotted movement. Dear God, she ran. 2 years earlier, Tyler Green had stood outside the Benton County Animal Shelter, shivering in the early spring rain. He hadn't meant to come looking for a dog. His buddy, Mike, had called in a favor, needed help dropping off a batch of donated supplies. Just a quick trip, 10 minutes, tops. But as Tyler hauled boxes through the rear entrance, he passed a row of kennels. Dogs barked and howled, some jumping at the chain-link fences, others curled in corners, worn down by too many quiet nights and not enough attention. One kennel stood apart. No barking, no pacing, just a single German shepherd, sitting perfectly still. His ears were perked, eyes watching everything. A laminated tag on the cage door read, Max, 3 years, final day. Tyler paused. What's this mean? He asked the tech behind the counter, nodding toward the cage. The woman didn't even look up. Euthanasia list, scheduled for tomorrow morning. Why? Tyler's voice sharpened. No adopters. Too big, too much energy. History's unknown. Some military connection, but we didn't get records. Tyler stood there for a long moment, staring through the mesh. The shepherd didn't move, didn't bark. He just watched. And then, so gently, it felt like a gesture instead of an instinct, he lowered his head and leaned slightly against the door, as if inviting trust. 15 minutes later, Tyler was calling Kayla from the truck. We don't have dog food, she said. I'll figure it out. That's not the point, Ty. You know it's not. But when Tyler brought Max home that night and Kayla sat on the floor to examine him, the dog quietly pressed his head into her lap like he belonged there. Neither of them could say no after that. They never found out exactly where Max had come from. The faded tattoo in his ear hinted at military service, numbers and letters that didn't quite match standard adoption coding. Tyler looked it up once. It was consistent with working dogs used in overseas personnel recovery operations. Dogs trained not just to fight, but to find, to navigate hostile terrain, to detect explosives, to bring people home. Max didn't need commands. He didn't bark for fun. He slept near doors. He checked windows. When Harper was born, he began sleeping outside her nursery every night. It became part of their rhythm. What they didn't know was that Max remembered everything. The crash, the chaos, the shouts. He remembered all of it. He remembered the sound of the tree coming down, the way Tyler had screamed, "Kayla, grab Harper," just before the floor gave way. He remembered digging through dust and debris to reach the crib. He remembered Harper's cries and the way the air had filled with the sharp, copper scent of gas and blood. And he remembered what Tyler told him. Go. Get help. By the time they wheeled Max through the side entrance of Snowcap Medical Center, the storm had tapered into a grim, frozen calm. Plows carved slow lines through the streets, but the hospital remained on emergency power, running on coffee, adrenaline, and instinct. Max was laid gently on a padded mat in an auxiliary treatment room, while Dr. May Whitlow, a retired vet who volunteered during crises, quietly cleaned the blood from his matted fur. He didn't resist, didn't make a sound. Even with wounds along his flank and paws shredded from ice and debris, the dog remained alert, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion, but aware, watching every movement around him with the same solemn vigilance he had when he stood in the lobby, soaked and bleeding, refusing to give up until someone listened. Word of what he had done spread quickly. Among nurses and orderlies, EMTs and night shift janitors, the story traveled like a warm ember in a cold room. How a battered German shepherd had carried an infant on his back through a blizzard. How he refused to rest until she was safe. People began to linger in the hallway outside his room, pressing fingertips to the glass, whispering in awe or just watching in reverent silence. But not everyone met the dog's presence with wonder. Dr. Eric Landon, chief orthopedic surgeon and one of the most respected figures in Snowcap's history, paused when he saw Max for the first time. His usually composed features flickered, his eyes narrowing not with confusion, but recognition. He approached slowly, knelt beside the dog without speaking, and with a gloved hand gently pushed back the fur along Max's ear. Beneath the scarred skin, faded and nearly unreadable, was a string of inked characters. A tattoo, military in origin. Landon stared for a long moment before rising, the tension in his jaw betraying something far older than the snowstorm. He left without a word. Officer Lauren Tate noticed the exchange. She had been there since Max's arrival, coordinating with the EMS teams, monitoring updates on the Green family's condition, and making sure the dog received attention before he collapsed. She hadn't missed the look in Landon's eyes, or the way he had left so quickly afterward. Something about it made her chest tighten. Later, while Harper slept under warm lights in pediatric observation, and Kayla remained in surgery with internal bleeding and a punctured lung, Lauren sat in the break room scanning public military archives on her department-issued tablet. It didn't take long to find the code. The tattoo belonged to a retired military working dog named Max, formerly assigned to a personnel recovery unit in Iraq under the 5th Special Forces Group. His handler had been Captain Shane Mallory, KIA, during an ambush just outside Mosul. Max had survived the attack after shielding Mallory from enemy fire. According to declassified records, the dog had been extracted along with the captain's body, suffering shrapnel wounds and psychological trauma. Following evaluation, he was deemed unfit for further deployment and retired. But before being placed in adoption, Max had been enrolled in a privately funded experimental program focused on canine trauma recovery. The trial had been controversial, unregulated, and, most notably, led by Dr. Eric Landon. Lauren's blood ran cold. The pieces clicked too easily. Landon hadn't just seen a wounded animal. He had seen a ghost from a past he hadn't accounted for. The trial had ended in silence, with scattered reports of ethical complaints. No formal charges, but enough concern that Landon had shifted his career from research to surgery not long after. Now, fate had placed the very subject of that unfinished chapter back in front of him, not as a failed case, but as a hero whose actions could not be denied. And Landon had said nothing. As Lauren sat with this knowledge, the hallway outside Max's recovery room darkened with new shadows. Not long after the hospital administrator reviewed his chart, Child Protective Services arrived. The agent, a woman in a gray coat with the calm detachment of someone who had seen too much, spoke in quiet tones with staff before requesting a conference room. Her voice, though polite, carried a certainty that was impossible to ignore. With both parents in critical condition and no extended family available, the infant, Harper, would be placed into temporary foster care within 48 hours. The matter of the dog, meanwhile, would fall under municipal animal control. Ownership couldn't be determined, and no one had the legal authority to claim him. Lauren didn't argue, yet. She simply nodded, kept her hands folded, and waited until the agent left the room. Then she walked back down the hall to pediatric observation and watched Harper sleep, her tiny body curled inside the blanket Max had carried her in, her hand resting instinctively on the stitched fabric as if it still offered some kind of protection. Later that evening, while nurses adjusted the monitors and the staff whispered updates on Kayla's post-op progress, Max stirred. He lifted his head slowly, sniffed the air, and scanned the hallway. Harper had been brought out briefly for bottle feeding, her tiny coos echoing softly through the ward. When her voice reached Max's ears, he lifted his front paw and pressed it gently to the glass. The baby, though not yet walking, responded instantly. In a moment that silenced everyone nearby, Harper reached toward the window, her fingers spread. Her mouth moved, and the sound that came out was soft but unmistakable. Not a cry, not a babble, but a word, the first she'd ever spoken. Ma. Her voice wasn't directed at Lauren or the nurse holding her. It was aimed squarely at the battered German shepherd lying on the other side of the glass. Her eyes didn't leave him. When the nurse tried to turn her gently toward the bottle, Harper resisted, stretching her hand again toward Max and repeating the sound. Ma. A hush fell over the room. Max didn't move closer. He didn't bark or whine. He simply placed his chin on his paws, watching the child with the kind of gaze that had no clinical term, one born of something deeper than instinct. A bond formed in smoke and snow, blood and breath. A bond that now spoke louder than any regulation. And in that moment, even Officer Tate, who had seen plenty in her years behind the badge, felt something shift, as if whatever storm had passed through their town hadn't just torn down trees and homes, but quietly uncovered something else, something long buried, something that refused to be forgotten. Snowcap Medical Center settled into a gray quiet the next morning, the kind that followed every crisis, when the adrenaline thins, when sleep-deprived nurses exchange weary glances, when clipboards clack instead of alarms. A dusting of snow still clung to the edges of window panes, but the roads had cleared just enough for government vehicles to begin appearing like clockwork. With them came polished shoes, clipped badges, and folders marked "Temporary Custody Transfer," each one a reminder that bureaucracy rarely waited for families to heal. Lauren Tate hadn't slept. She sat outside pediatric observation, elbows on her knees, staring at the pale blue door behind which Harper now slept in a plastic crib. The child had settled after her second bottle and hadn't stirred since, but Max, who lay outside the door like a shadow, refused to rest. His eyes remained fixed on the threshold, ears twitching with every motion. The hospital had moved him into a quieter wing, away from the main traffic, and placed a simple sign above his bed. Animal patient. No interaction without approval. But the real change had already begun. Eric Landon stood in the hallway beside Lauren, his hands in the pockets of a coat too thin for the weather. The man who once demanded Max be removed for barking now looked hollowed out, like a man trying to patch holes in a dam he'd ignored for years. He hadn't said much since the previous night, but that morning, as they stood under the two bright hallway lights, he finally began to speak. He told her everything. How, after Iraq, after the collapse of his overseas surgical tours, he'd accepted a grant to explore new treatment methods for animals experiencing post-traumatic stress. How Max had been one of the first dogs brought to the facility. How the treatments, experimental, deeply flawed, and far ahead of ethical review, had offered promise but spiraled under pressure. The funding had dried up, complaints had mounted, and Max, the only dog to withstand the early trials, had vanished from Landon's radar when the program was shut down quietly. "I thought he'd been euthanized," Landon said, voice barely audible. "I thought that was my final shame." But then came the storm. The baby, the blood, and the dog who refused to die. Lauren didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Landon's guilt was already unwinding itself in every word, in every pause where regret cracked through his careful diction. He turned away from the window and pulled out his phone. With steady fingers, he dialed a number she didn't recognize and waited. When the voice answered on the other end, his spine straightened. "Rachel, I need a favor. Big one." His younger sister, Senator Rachel Beckman, had built a career off doing what few dared, pressing for reform in the child welfare system, standing firm against bureaucratic red tape, and never apologizing for choosing heart over protocol. Within 2 hours, she arrived at the hospital in a state-issued SUV with an aide and a paralegal. Her presence was like throwing open a locked door. Papers moved, phones rang, and within the span of that afternoon, things began to change. Lauren was no stranger to protective custody laws. She knew the process, had sat in on enough court-ordered removals to understand that most workers were simply doing their jobs. But what she also knew, what Rachel Beckman reminded everyone, is that there were exceptions. Legal loopholes. Temporary guardianship clauses buried in state welfare code that allowed for emergency placement with trusted public servants during periods of crisis. And as a decorated officer with no prior complaints, no criminal record, and verified ties to the child's immediate rescue, Lauren became eligible. The paperwork was thick, but Beckman's aide handled it in record time. By nightfall, Harper's temporary foster care order had been reclassified under emergency protective placement, assigning Lauren as her interim guardian, pending review. But that solved only half the problem. The other half still lay on a mat outside Harper's room, silent, vigilant, wounded, but alive. Animal control had called twice. The file sat in the hospital office, listing Max as an unclaimed dog requiring impound for evaluation. But Senator Beckman's legal team had anticipated this too. While Lauren signed the last of the guardianship documents, Landon submitted a sealed affidavit to the attending staff. A medical declaration attesting to Max's neurological trauma, coupled with historical evidence of his previous classification as a working dog. Under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Max, having provided critical emergency assistance and now offering therapeutic comfort to Harper, was eligible for reclassification as a medical support animal. The law was clear. He could not be removed from her without endangering her psychological well-being. The two had become a unit, legally, emotionally, permanently. By the time the CPS caseworker returned that evening with final clearance papers, her tone had shifted from firm to flustered. She reviewed the files, the senator's signature, and the stack of corroborating documents, then set her pen down. No further action is necessary. Max would stay, so would Harper. As Lauren carried Harper out of the pediatric wing, wrapped in the same flannel blanket that had once been tied to Max's back, the dog rose and followed beside them without being told. His limp had improved slightly. The gauze was tight across his ribs, but he didn't show pain. Just focus. Just calm. Later that night, in the guest room of Lauren's modest two-bedroom home tucked near the tree line, Max lay curled beside the crib. Harper's tiny breath moved steady and soft. Lauren sat outside the doorway with a glass of untouched wine, her badge still clipped to her belt, staring out the frosted window with thoughts she couldn't shake. Across town, a single check was written, untraceable, quiet. Dr. Landon made the payment in full, to cover the Green family's hospital bills, structural repairs to the home, and a 3-month supply of medical-grade dog food to be delivered anonymously to Lauren's address. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but because some things once broken can only be mended by acts that ask for nothing in return. The winds that once screamed down the ridge now whispered gently through the new pine trees lining the Green family's rebuilt home. Summer had given way to early fall, and Glenridge stood quieter than before, calmer, more watchful. The scars of the storm had been swept, hammered, and stitched away, but its imprint remained, not in ruin, but in renewal. The house itself stood taller now. The blueprint had been altered from the original, this time with wide hallways and ramps that wrapped seamlessly from the porch to the back door. Inside, every corner had been softened, every edge child-proofed. The nursery was no longer tucked away upstairs but opened off the living room where sunlight pooled during the golden hours. A photo hung in the entryway. Kayla, her hand resting gently on her belly, smiling down at Harper, who clutched Max's ear like it was a lifeline. The baby was no longer just crawling. She had begun her first tentative steps, not bold, not rushed, but slow and steady, always with Max beside her. His fur had darkened with age, his stride still slightly uneven from the storm's aftermath, but he moved like a shadow behind her, patient and unshakable. Harper's hands never reached for furniture or walls, only for the thick ruff of fur at Max's neck. She didn't need balance when he was there. She had him. Tyler stood outside most mornings now, hammer in hand, helping local volunteers finish the last details of his newest project, Max's Shield, Rescue Canine Academy. What started as an idea scribbled on the back of a hospital discharge sheet had turned into something real. With donations pouring in and Senator Rachel Beckman's endorsement, the center had opened with the mission of training rescue dogs not just for combat or police work, but for therapy, disaster response, and family reunification. And at its heart, the symbol on the door was unmistakable, a silhouette of a German shepherd carrying a child through the snow. Kayla, now 6 months pregnant with their second child, spent her afternoons on the bench beneath the oak tree behind the house. Her body still carried echoes of the injuries she'd endured, but her eyes had never been brighter. She often rested a hand over her stomach, humming softly while watching Harper and Max explore the new grass, the rebuilt swing set, the pine saplings they'd planted together. One tree stood taller than the rest, barely more than a pole right now, its trunk narrow and reaching, with a wooden plaque nailed into the earth beside it. The Max tree, from loyalty we grew. No one walked past it without pausing. The town hadn't forgotten either. That October, Lauren Tate had been invited to a ceremony in Denver, hosted by the National Association for Military Working Dogs. It was the kind of formal affair she typically avoided. Rows of uniforms, crisp speeches, medals polished within an inch of their lives. But this time, she wore her dress blues and stood tall as they called Max's name. She stepped forward to receive the medal on his behalf, a silver star inscribed with one word, Protector. There hadn't been a dry eye in the room. Dr. Eric Landon didn't attend the ceremony. He didn't speak publicly about what had happened, but his name quietly appeared as the lead donor for Max's Shield. He funded the therapy wing, the mobile rescue van, and the veterinary scholarships, all in silence. It was never about redemption. It was about responsibility. He visited the Green family only once, standing by the gate while Harper napped inside and Max watched him from the porch. Landon gave a small nod. Max didn't move, but he didn't growl either. That was enough. Autumn crept in with orange skies and longer shadows. The air turned crisp, and the last of the leaves fell along the edge of the backyard, where Max now preferred to lie during the late afternoon. He was never far from Harper, not even in sleep. When the sun sank behind the ridge, he would rise, stretch, and step into her room before anyone else. No one told him to, he simply knew. That evening, as twilight settled across Glenridge like a wool blanket, the house held a quiet peace. Inside, Harper slept with one hand curled near her mouth, the other resting on Max's back. The dog lay curled on the rug beside her crib, his breathing slow, even. His eyes flickered briefly at a distant rustle outside the window, then softened again. Nothing stirred. Nothing needed defending, not tonight. Outside, the wind moved gently through the new pine. It passed over the plaque, whispered through the grass, and drifted toward the porch, where the light clicked on automatically. And there, beneath the oak and the stars and the silence, lay Max. The shepherd who had once bled through a storm, who had carried a life on his back, who had waited until she could walk before finally letting himself rest. A hero not made by command, or by war, or by title, but by choice and by love.